My next guest was the man who held the largest blank cheque IPO before Tony Hayward came along. Martin Franklin joins me now from our studio in Sao Paulo. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. First of all, talk us through why people invest in these so-called blank cheque companies. It would seem counterintuitive to invest in a company when you don't know what it's going to do.
Well, I would say, first of all, it's exactly what you mentioned earlier on. It's a back-the-jockey kind of vehicle. But it's a very interesting play if you're from the investor side, because on the one hand, as you make your investment, you have very limited downside in a down market. If you look at the performance of the markets, the overall equity markets at the moment, because these vehicles are largely backed fully by cash, until they actually make a transaction or make an acquisition or a merger of some kind, there's really very little volatility in the shares. So your downside is limited while you make the investment. On the upside, if you're backing people who you believe can create value for shareholders, and you have a view about what you think their return criteria should be, you really get a liquid investment that gives you the ability to make a private equity type of return into a vehicle that is quoted as a public company. So it's a bit of a hybrid proposition.
You mentioned there the phrase backing the jockey. Very few people have actually been able to do these vehicles. You're one of them, Tony Hayward's another. What does it take?
Well, I think it takes a long track record. It takes, I think, two things. One is a long track record, a particular aspect that appeals to investors, whether it be being an operator, as I think is the case for Tony Hayward, whether it be an investor with a reputation of a long track record of investment performance. I think also relationships with institutional investors. I think that institutional investors have a comfort feeling on operators that they know, and I think people who decide to go out and build vehicles like this usually have a history with dealing with the major institutions out there, whether they be the Fidelities, the Wellingtons, or the BlackRocks of the world.
Now, there has been some criticism about these blank cheque companies getting IPOs essentially through the back door. What would you say to that? Do you accept that?
Well, I think it's very much the case, particularly in their original incarnation. In the old days, these were ways of companies that were not ready for prime time to go public. What has changed is the scale has created a totally different investment criteria, in the sense that now you're dealing with, instead of $50 million vehicles or £50 million vehicles that create public companies that are probably too small to be appropriate as public companies. You now have hundreds of millions and billions of dollars being raised that create companies that become, FTSE 100 or FTSE 250 companies on their entry onto the market, and therefore become, if you like, companies that deserve to be public, that will get a natural following. They fall into sectors that attract an investor base. So I think it's a bit of an apple and an orange, and the history of these vehicles, I think, is where that reputation comes from. But I think that the companies that are getting created nowadays become, very interesting public entities.